Why of all the mythical creatures is the vampire the most well-known? And despite the vast variety of monsters throughout history, why do so many people aspire to be like these creatures? The vampire legend has persisted for centuries and remains particularly popular as we approach the transition to winter, known as Samhain to the Celts, All Hallows' Eve to early Christians, and what we now refer to as Halloween. In this video, we will delve into the origins of this creature, its ancient history, and attempt to understand why the vampire has such a strong hold on our global psyche. Welcome to the mysteries of mythology, the vampire. Much of what we think of vampires today comes from the book by the great 19th century Irish author, Bram Stoker. In this version, the intelligent, cunning, and seductive monster from Transylvania is loosely connected to the historical figure Vlad III, Dracula, better known as Vlad the Impaler. But in truth, the creature in Bram Stoker's novel is entirely based on the author's imagination. To give the author credit, Stoker was known to have extensively researched Eastern European folklore in preparation for writing his book. One of the sources that may have been used was the 1819 novelette written by English writer John Polidori, simply titled The Vampire. In this short story, the vampire named Lord Ruthven had many similarities with Stoker's Dracula, being intelligent, of nobility, seductive, and having a penchant for corrupting his victims before killing them. One key difference is that Polidori's tale takes place in Greece rather than Transylvania, and this may be more accurate with the creature's history, as we'll see later. Stoker's vampire also includes the idea that the creature is cursed. Once a mortal, Dracula chose to affront God, and so was transformed into this creature instead of being born that way. The further back we travel, the more we see that what is commonly seen as a fictional character today was once seen as a creature as real as deers found in the forest. And we don't have to travel that far back in time. As late as the 17th century, even the famous philosopher Voltaire wrote about whether these creatures actually existed. As we go deeper into the history of the creature's bloody lore, we can perhaps start with its name. If I were to ask you where the word vampire comes from, you would probably think Romania, specifically Transylvania. You'd be close geographically, but on the opposite end culturally. The word is believed to originate from either a Slavic or Turkish word, upir, but was actually to describe a witch, not the creature we think of today. This word migrated to Hungary, where it became the more familiar-sounding vampire, and finally to France, where it became vampire. The actual Romanian name for a vampire is strigoi, which likely has its roots in the Greek word strix. And this is where things get interesting. As early as the 4th century BC, there is a Greek story about Polyphonte and her two bear-like sons, Agrios and Oreos, who were transformed into bird-like creatures called strix as punishment for their cannibalism. These birds hung upside down from their feet, screaming in the night without food or drink. Originally, these creatures were associated with owls, but it's easy to see how another nocturnal flying creature could be described in the same way: a bat. Until this time, the strix wasn't seen as a direct threat to humans, but more of a bad omen or a harbinger of war. Only when the myths changed hands with the Romans did it begin to be seen as a bloodthirsty monster in bird form. Across the world, vampires are best known for their ability to drain their victims' life essence. For example, in China, the Jiangshi, the stiff-hopping vampire, tries to drain the qi, or life force, from its victims. In the West, when we think of vampires, we often think of one thing as their source of food. blood. A possible early connection between the dead and blood comes from the ancient Greek poet Homer. In his epic The Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the land of the dead to get advice from the spirit of Tiresias, a prophet who can see the future even after death. Odysseus needs Tiresias's guidance to find his way home and learn how to appease the gods. While he's there, he also speaks to the spirits of his mother, Anticlea, as well as two famous Greek warriors from the Trojan War, Achilles and Agamemnon. However, before they can speak, they need to drink the blood of a goat that Odysseus pours into a pit. The blood gives the spirits the strength to remember their lives and communicate with him. It is this offering of blood that draws the spirits to Odysseus, though they are not vampires in the modern sense. But this connection of feeding the dead is not something limited to the stories of ancient Greek poets. As early as ancient Egypt, we see the dead buried with food. They believed that the deceased would need sustenance in the afterlife, so they provided offerings such as bread, beer, fruits, vegetables, and sometimes even meat in the tombs. Images of food and models of servants, called shabti or ushabti, were also placed in the tombs to symbolically provide for the deceased's needs. Soon after, the bell beaker culture, which spread across parts of Europe, appeared around 2400 BC to 1800 BC. They are known for their distinctive pottery, shaped like bell beakers, and their burial practices often including the dead being buried with food. Later, the Romans would leave cakes, grains, or offer milk to their deceased relatives, believing that these offerings nourished the spirits. In some cases, people even bored holes through the stones that covered tomb entrances, allowing food to be passed through as an offering to the dead. This practice was documented in medieval Ireland, with food passed through holes in tombs to appease the spirits within. This fear of the hungry dead can also be seen in later stories. The Norse Draugr, for example, was thought to rise from its grave and roam if not properly pacified. Unlike spirits, the Draugr was a physical corpse that could walk again, much like later vampire myths. Similar to vampires, the Draugr could shapeshift and enter people's dreams, and while they preferred the night, daylight didn't harm them. Destroying a Draugr often involved wrestling it back into its grave or even beheading it, a theme that also appears in many vampire stories. The strigoi, common in Romanian folklore, were not just undead vampires, but also living witches or sorcerers who sent their spirits out at night to drink blood. The strigoi could also become even more powerful after death, and many myths told of how improper burial or curses could turn someone into a strigoi. This was the specific myth that Bram Stoker drew from when writing Dracula, though he used the more familiar English term vampire. In Balkan countries, male vampires were driven by a desire for women, leading to tales of union between vampires and mortal women, resulting in children called dampiers. These children were said to have certain vampire-like abilities, though they did not fully transform into vampires themselves. The strigoi and the more common European vampire often overlap in their traits, but one thing remains clear. Vampires in all their forms were deeply tied to the anxieties of death, disease, and the supernatural. The connection between the dead and disease is a theme in many ancient traditions. The Norse Draugr and Gaelic revenants were both believed to spread sickness and death, often due to the uncleanliness of the corpse. While the concept of germs is modern, ancient peoples understood that filth and decay were linked to illness. Purification rituals, such as the washing away of sins, were common in pagan traditions and carried over into Christianity in the form of baptism. The vampire, like the Draugr, was believed to bring disease or sudden death to those they visited. In Slavic regions, for instance, vampires were thought to appear to their family members after their death. If seen, the person who encountered the vampire would often die within days. Historical accounts from Moravia, Hungary, and Romania tell of bodies being dug up and found in an unnatural state, soft, colorful, undecayed, but giving off a terrible smell. To stop the spread of death, these corpses were staked, beheaded, or burned, much like later vampire tales. Things became particularly intense in the 18th century when reports of vampire attacks became widespread. One of the earliest documented cases of vampire hysteria occurred in the Serbian village of Kisiljevo, shortly after the death of a man named Peter Blagojevic in 1725. Following his burial, 9 villagers fell ill and died within a week. Before their deaths, several of these victims claimed, while on their deathbeds, that Blagojevic had appeared to them at night and attacked or choked them. His widow also reported that Peter had come to their home, demanding his shoes. In response to these eerie claims and mounting fear, the villagers insisted on exhuming Blagojevic's body. When they did so, they were shocked to find that his body showed no signs of decomposition. His hair and nails had grown, and fresh blood was found around his mouth, which the villagers interpreted as proof of vampirism. Convinced that Blagojevic had become a vampire, they drove a stake through his heart and burned his body, after which the strange deaths in the village ceased. Modern forensic science can provide a likely explanation for what the villagers observed when they exhumed Peter Blagojevic. Many of the characteristics they attributed to vampirism are now understood as normal stages of decomposition. As a body decays, internal gases accumulate, causing the abdomen to bloat and the skin to stretch tightly, giving the appearance of a full belly as if the corpse had recently eaten. Additionally, the recession of the skin and gums can make the hair, nails, and teeth appear longer, though they do not actually grow. Blood or other fluids can seep from the mouth and nose as the body breaks down, which may have been mistaken for signs of recent feeding. The association of vampires with disease is where we probably get one of the most powerful weapons against vampires: garlic. Garlic has been used for centuries in many cultures as a natural remedy and a form of protection. Its strong odor was believed to ward off evil spirits, demons, and even illness. Since vampires were often thought to bring disease and death, garlic became a symbol of life and purity, exactly the opposite of what vampires represent. Garlic's natural antimicrobial properties also played a role in its association with repelling evil. People noticed that garlic helped fight infections and sickness, so they believed it could protect them from the supernatural dangers of vampires as well. In Slavic and Eastern European folklore, garlic was used in rituals to ward off these undead creatures, and over time, this became a popular belief that spread across many cultures. In vampire stories, garlic is often portrayed as a simple but effective defense, whether hung in homes or worn around the neck. Its connection to purification, healing, and its strong, life-affirming properties made it a natural choice for combating creatures of death like vampires. The rise of vampire hysteria in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries reflected deep-seated fears about death and the dead. The rise of Christianity saw offering food and gifts to the dead as pagan and therefore sinful. As people stopped performing traditional rites for the dead from the old faiths, such as leaving offerings at grave sites, anxiety grew about whether the dead were at peace. The belief that vampires were attacking their own relatives stemmed from this fear that the dead might seek revenge on the living for being neglected. Whether digging up graves to behead corpses or driving stakes through the dead, the lengths people went to in order to protect themselves from vampires show how powerful these beliefs were. In some cases, it was even thought that vampires might rise because they had been buried alive. The fear of the walking dead was very real, and vampire tales tapped into the deep human concern about what happens after death. Historically, vampires were more like zombies, mindless creatures hungry for human blood or flesh. The more human version of vampires came after John Polidori's novella, giving the creature a backstory of being an intelligent, suave nobleman. The changes continued with Bram Stoker's Dracula, who could transform into nocturnal birds, specifically bats, perhaps because the vampire bat was making headlines at the time. Stoker also gave the vampire powers of strength, agility, hypnosis, and the inability to be reflected in mirrors. He also introduced the vampire's vulnerabilities, such as the need for soil from his homeland of Transylvania to rest and heal, and the need to be invited into a home to enter. It wasn't until the German silent film Nosferatu that the concept of sunlight being able to kill a vampire was introduced. The vampire is perhaps the most resilient of all mythical creatures that, in a modern, rational thinking society, still finds devotees willing to explain their existence scientifically. Like the creature, their myth is almost impossible to kill. Like a vampire needs blood to survive, I need your comments and likes. Thank you for watching.